I want to start today with the story of when I was sent to the principal's office. I was probably not surprisingly, a fairly obedient child. The only real trouble I ever got into before this was trying to skip homeroom. My senior year, I was infected by senioritis and got caught halfway across the parking lot by my homeroom teacher. When I got sent to the principal's office, though, I wasn't a kid. I was a student teacher, I was 22, and I was in trouble. It was the fall of 2008, which you will remember was an election year. Barack Obama was squaring off against John McCain, and it was on everyone's mind. As a student teacher, I was teaching a course on American society, and I believed it was important in our schools to talk about current issues and our political system. It felt almost like a moral imperative. Education, after all, creates a good citizenry. So during one exercise, I had the class discuss the formation of political parties and discuss our current two-party system. I tried very hard to frame it in a nonpartisan way, in a way that would be unbiased. I handed out copies of the party platforms, which were on the websites, basically the positions that each party articulated themselves. Using those, we created a big T-chart on the board, one side Republicans, one side Democrats, and explaining that these were generalizations to some degree and that there was diversity within the parties. We did our best to try and outline the major party principles so that the class and the students would understand the differences and what was at stake in these elections. We listed things like small government, robust military spending, environmental regulation, and the list can go on. The class seemed to go fine. My hope was that it helped students better understand the people in the country that they lived in and what this whole election was about. But the next day, I got the summons to the principal's office. Now, for context, I had never met the principal. I had never seen the principal. I didn't know where the principal's office was. The school was very large. Student teachers were very low on the org chart. And people like the principals did not concern themselves with people like me. So it was both very surprising to get this phone call from the office and also intimidating. I was nervous. So I went. I sat in the same chair that I'm sure many a delinquent youth sat in when they were called in. And the principal sat me down and said that she had spent all morning getting yelled at by a furious parent of one of my students about the lesson that I had taught the day before. The principal told me that a parent from that class had seen their child's notebook. The notes that their student wrote included disparaging comments about the Republican Party. I never found out exactly what they were, only that they were really bad and explicit. The parent blamed me for including it on the T-chart. They were angry, outraged, and offended. Sitting in the principal's office, I tried to explain that I couldn't imagine doing something so blatantly offensive. I had tried to be careful. I would later learn that a friend of the student had written in the notebook as a joke over lunch. But no one knew that then, and the result was the same. The principal banned me from teaching about politics again, and banned me from teaching anything remotely controversial. She told me anything that is touchy, too likely to offend, I couldn't be trusted to handle it. This is a world that we live in today where it is easy to cause offense. Like the parent whose knee-jerk reaction was to phone the school principal in outrage, it is sometimes our default response. It is, as my experience shows, useful, powerful. It gets results. It is everywhere. The news reads like one long list of outrageous and offensive behavior that is designed to shock and appall us, but also requires us and motivates us to act in response. This can feel like many things. It can feel exhausting because there is so much wrong happening all the time. And it can be confusing because norms and expectations around what is offensive seems to change, sometimes year to year. With all this confusion and outrage out there, I think sometimes it's helpful to ask the simple question, what is really offensive? What should we be offended about? How do we cut through the noise to determine what is out of bounds and what is not? Is there a guiding principle, a cheat code that could help us navigate this very complex world? I started thinking about this fall in earnest. It was prompted by the rise of a phrase that some of you may know, some of you may not have heard of, called "Okay, Boomer," which took off online among Generation Zers. Generation Zers are the youngest generation currently alive. They're in their college years, early college years, and teens and below. Okay, Boomer is a phrase that is meant to be dismissive of boomers, perhaps even to offend. It is used by young people as a glib response to older people when the latter says something that is perceived as being condescending or patronizing. It emerges from younger people's frustration with the state of the world and perceived generational ignorance and intransience around issues like climate change, racism, and gender diversity. It's linked to frustrations about not being able to get a job as a young person, or being accused of being lazy in an economic system that is clearly broken, and student loans that are crushing. It's a resentment for being mocked as being entitled for being given participation trophies as kids by the very people who gave them those trophies. Now, it is to be understandable that many people and many older adults in particular don't feel very good about being told, "Okay, Boomer," after they say something. It feels disrespectful. It feels insulting. It is perceived as being ageist and needlessly snarky. Some have even compared it to a racial slur, others to homophobic language. I've watched this conversation play out online. My fiance, who teaches college kids, have heard them use it in conversations. People online who hear it sometimes get very angry and are outraged and offended. It is nuanced, though. Many Gen Zers and younger millennials were widely hesitant to typecast an entire generation. They argued that OK Boomer was more about a mentality than about a particular age, and began to use the slightly tongue-in-cheek response #NotAllBoomers when confronted. Okay, Boomer, in a more nuanced perspective, is more about a person's unwillingness to change, be open to new ideas, and see things from a different perspective. A millennial or a Gen Z could be on the receiving end of Okay, Boomer if they inhabited those traits. I was trying to understand why people were so upset about all these things, and so I went to my most reliable Boomer people in my life, my parents, and I asked them. My dad turned 70 2 weeks ago. My mom will turn 72 this week. And neither of them had followed the controversy very closely, but both, in hearing about it, had feelings. My dad's initial reaction was that OK Boomer was rude. But then he started telling a story about when he was drafted into the Army during Vietnam, an endearingly Boomer story to tell that my dad has told for many years. He remembers how he and many soldiers got called a lot of bad names. He said, "You just learned to deal with it because that's how life was, and ultimately, it wasn't that bad. My mom's initial reaction was that it was also kind of rude. She shared how the younger generation didn't understand how hard boomers had to fight for basic rights and respect, especially women in the workplace, and that young people didn't understand just how much suffering that had gone into that. She talked about the abuse she suffered as the first female faculty member at her university and the constant harassment she faced as a rebuttal to the sense that everyone has it good in that generation. My conversation with her pivoted to why young people were frustrated and why they would need a phrase like "okay, boomer." She had taught lots of young people over her years, and having her work recently gone viral on the app TikTok, used by teens and many Gen Zers, she was, to her credit, sensitive to the issues that the younger generation was raising. And talking to young people, she said she agreed with most everything that they actually said, despite the tone. About climate change, she went as far as to say, any generation that doesn't believe in climate change deserves to be erased from the planet. She said, the world doesn't need another boomer with strong opinion who is about to pass away in 5 years. It is intense, but my mom usually expresses her opinions in that way. Both my parents, both boomers, are obviously conflicted. They don't like the tone of it, but they also see that there is a purpose and a reason behind the phrase. Now, I'm very fond of the boomer generation and older generations. I am deeply indebted to them, both because of my parents, but because most of the people who have mentored me, inspired me, and taught me, people who have made me who I am and believed in me as a young person, were of that generation. They believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and I wouldn't be the person I am without them. I have seen and heard from them real ageism that takes place against older generations, and there is a deep injustice there, and how difficult it is to find work, how lifetime of experience is dismissed and disrespected, and how dehumanizing the aging process can be. But I also understand the feelings that cause young people to offend with language like "okay, boomer." There is a realistic fear and anxiety and even despair about the world that young people will inherit. Feelings that make a phrase like "okay, boomer" feel like a small offense compared to the large problems of the world and the refusal of those in power to do anything about them. We might wish the phrase was nicer and less rude and less dismissive, but underneath the snark is real pain and real fear and frustration at feeling deeply helpless and frustrated in the face of a very bleak future. It would be generous and just for all of us to try and understand and honor those feelings rather than to simply silence and dismiss them. The "okay, boomer" controversy is just one small example of how complicated offensiveness can be. But it suggests a path forward, I think, to determining what is truly offensive and what simply is uncomfortable. The number one thing we need to think about when understanding what is offensive and what is not is power. Who has it and who does not? If there's a cardinal rule about how we should understand the world and everything in it, it should be to examine always the power dynamics at play. When you look at who has power, you discover who is safe. When you look at who has power, you discover who is at risk and in danger, for whom the conversation represents either an intellectual exercise or emotional discomfort, and for whom the issues potentially are a matter of life and death. When someone says they are offended, it means very different things for those sitting with power and those sitting without it. There are billionaires in this world, for example, who have expressed recently their offense as it suggested that there should be no billionaires in this world. Those billionaires are not truly at risk. They may feel that they have legitimate reasons to be offended, genuine feelings that they are treated unfairly or having the rules change puts them at a disadvantage, or that they have lost something that they have truly earned. But nothing about their fundamental way of life would be threatened. If we abolished billionaires, the newly made millionaires would still be just fine. And that is very different than those who lack power when they say that they are offended. When someone is without power or on the margins, being offended is not simply a feeling of discomfort, but a fear of real consequences, a fear of abuse. Racist and homophobic language is offensive not because it just hurts emotionally or makes people feel ouch, but because it brings a real threat of harm and a denial of personhood and possibly violence. There is a real and essential difference between these two things, between being uncomfortable with something someone has done or said and having your life threatened or dismissed. If we equate the two, we equate perceived harm and real harm. We equate feeling unease with feeling unsafe, and those two things are not the same. Understanding power and the differences of power is necessary to cut through the noise of people claiming offense when no true offense exists. In today's world, it is so easy to claim that we are offended and weaponize it to avoid having to address our actions. We see it through tone policing, the idea that people must act or talk in a certain approved way. Otherwise, they are deemed offensive, no matter what they're actually trying to say or communicate or change. We see it through cries of persecution in places like Fox News, which spin narratives about Christians being treated as second-class citizens, or white people being discriminated against, or about wars on Christmas, or now, I guess, even wars on Thanksgiving. We see it through laments about PC culture and complaints that people are being silenced for just speaking their minds. These backlashes are a response to a changing society where certain groups and people are used to doing and saying whatever they want, whenever they want it, without consequence. They can offend, and those who they offend or feel differently didn't have the power to say anything, didn't feel safe enough to say anything. It is a small sign of progress that previously marginalized and silenced people feel safe and strong enough to come out and call out things that are truly offensive and dangerous and harmful. People threatened by this newfound power to cry offensive. They are trying to protect their historic privilege and maintain the status quo. They are offended by actions that challenge their supremacy. As the quote goes, when you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So people cry wolf. They say and raise their hand and say, my feelings are hurt. We don't talk like that here. Our job here is to determine what is actually happening, who is actually at risk of being hurt, and who is not. Learn to ask yourself, where is the power, and who is more powerful? Is it you? Is it somebody else? Who is afraid of losing their power and privilege? And is that why they are calling offense? Who has more to lose? Who is more vulnerable? Who is more at risk? As Unitarian Universalists, as people of good conscience, there's a good rule of thumb. that I think is helpful in navigating all of this. Be skeptical when those with power and privilege claim they are oppressed, marginalized, or victims, especially when they claim that their victimization is caused by people who are traditionally much less powerful. Such claims are at best misguided. At worst, they are lies. So listen to those who do not have power, who are taking a risk to speak out, who are truly vulnerable, whose lives depend on the issue at hand. Listen to those who have reason to fear for their families and their future. Maybe that's the young, or maybe that's the old. Maybe it's the poor or the bullied, the immigrant, the people of color, the differently abled, the atheist, the non-binary person. Just trust that when a vulnerable person says that something hurts or is problematic or threatening, they are being honest. It comes down to this: which side will you be on? The powerless or the powerful? Those who are comfortable and those who are at risk? That is the question for each of us. It is easy to be offended. It is easy to try to make people feel better. But it is more difficult, but vital, to think about where and when your anger is justified. Make sure as you decide to remember always the role of power and your power and those in this world who have it and those who do not. And that makes all the difference. May it be so, and amen.